Africa just did something no one expected. It stopped pretending to be weak. One continent, long divided and dismissed, is now acting with sharp unity, fierce ownership, and unapologetic defiance. Borders are being erased, resources reclaimed, alliances redrawn. Why now? Why so suddenly? And what happens when the most exploited continent starts rewriting the rules? Let's find out. When the announcement came, it didn't begin with fireworks. It didn't even begin with a warning. It came with a straight face and a signed declaration. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were dissolving the borders that had defined them for over a century. These were not casual reforms or vague plans. They were becoming one country, one flag, one army, one identity. A superstate was being born, not in Europe, not in Asia, but in the Sahel, the very region that had long been dismissed as the world's poorest and most unstable. To understand how shocking this move is, you have to understand what it destroys. The lines between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were drawn not by their people, but by European powers during the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884. Those colonial borders were never meant to serve Africa. They were designed to divide and weaken it. Generations were born and died within those invisible walls, believing they were natural, permanent, and inevitable. And yet, on a quiet afternoon in 2025, 3 heads of state declared them irrelevant. The message was simple, but seismic. The map we inherited is not the map we will live by. What makes this even more audacious is how it's being done. These are not nations coming together out of desperation. They are doing it from a position of defiance. Each of the 3 governments had already taken steps in recent months to distance itself from Western powers, especially France, the former colonial master. After military coups reshaped their leadership, they faced sanctions, travel bans, and diplomatic isolation. But rather than back down, they doubled down. And now, they've found strength in unity. This superstate is not just a political entity, it's a fortress. It sits on vast reserves of gold, uranium, and oil. It has the potential to command trade routes, control energy flows, and become a military heavyweight in a region once dominated by foreign troops. In a single move, the balance of power in West Africa has shifted, and the West didn't see it coming. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this union isn't what it builds, it's what it erases. By discarding their colonial borders, these nations are sending a signal to the rest of Africa. Those lines in the sand are not sacred, they are scars, and scars can heal. The superstate is not only a government project, it's a psychological rupture. It tells young Africans that they don't have to inherit division. They can create something new, together. Critics, of course, have already begun to stir. Some call it reckless, others say it won't last. But the leaders of this movement are not operating within the logic of Western diplomacy. They are building something out of necessity. Their regions have faced insurgency, sanctions, underdevelopment, and humiliation. And after decades of watching international institutions fail to protect or support them, they are choosing self-reliance over compliance. It is not just a rejection of colonial borders, it is a rejection of colonial thinking. This is why the announcement was so calm. There was no need for drama, because for these leaders this wasn't a radical act, it was a return to sanity. It was the end of isolation and the beginning of coordinated survival. In private briefings, diplomats are now whispering what they cannot say aloud. If this works, it could spread. If the superstate succeeds, it could be the prototype for a new African reality, one in which nations merge to amplify power rather than cling to their artificial separateness. It also raises a disturbing question for the West. What happens when African unity stops being theoretical? What happens when Africa builds its version of the European Union, not with blue flags and bureaucracy, but with steel, grit, and raw defiance? The answers are coming. But before we get there, one thing is certain. The formation of the Sahel superstate didn't just redraw a border, it redrew the future. Now, if 3 countries can erase colonial lines and become one, what happens when they also decide to take back the wealth beneath their feet? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If redrawing the borders was the beginning, then reclaiming the soil is the escalation. While the birth of the Sahel superstate turned heads above ground, a quieter but more dangerous revolution was erupting beneath it. Across the continent, African nations are no longer just defending their sovereignty with flags. They are defending it with minds. With every resource nationalized and every foreign contract renegotiated, the continent is launching a silent war, an economic one. In the heart of Niger, where yellow uranium dust once meant profit for French nuclear plants and poverty for local towns, a line was crossed. In a bold and uncompromising decision, the Nigerian government announced that its uranium wealth, long controlled by French multinationals, would no longer be up for negotiation. It wasn't a legal battle. It wasn't a slow, bureaucratic transition. It was a seizure. The mines that had lit up Paris would now power Niger. And for the first time, France had no say in it. To the global elite, it looked irrational. To the people of Niger, it looked like revenge. For decades, they watched their land get carved up, their resources siphoned off, their leaders bribed into silence. They heard the promises: schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. And yet, in uranium-rich towns, children still walked miles for water, and hospitals ran on candles. When the government cut off French access, it wasn't about profit. It was about finally saying, enough. Niger was not alone. Thousands of kilometers south, another quiet insurrection was taking place in Batswana. Known for its stability and well-managed diamond sector, Batswana had long been the poster child of Western resource partnerships. But in 2025, the mask came off. The government refused to renew exploitative contracts with De Beers, the British South African diamond giant that had controlled its stones since independence. For the first time, Botswana demanded a 50-50 share of the profits. Not a loan, not a grant, an equal stake. The shock wasn't in the demand, it was in the confidence. Botswana knew its worth. It knew that without its diamonds, the global luxury market would suffer. So it didn't plead. It was demanding. And more importantly, it signaled to every other African nation that even long-standing contracts could be broken when justice required it. Then came the wild card, the Democratic Republic of Congo. For decades, the DRC was a tragic example, rich in resources, poor in stability. But even here, the tide is turning. The Congolese government is now quietly rerouting its trade logistics. New railway lines funded by China, Russia, and local investors are being built to connect mines directly to ports, cutting off the need for foreign intermediaries. What used to be a game of exploitation is being flipped into a new model of control. Own the route, own the rules. This shift isn't just economic, it's psychological. For years, African governments were told that without Western expertise, their minerals would stay buried, that they didn't have the technical knowledge, the financial systems, or the diplomacy to run billion-dollar extractive industries. That lie has now collapsed. African engineers are building, African economists are planning, and African leaders are no longer afraid to nationalize what is theirs. But the stakes are rising. Western corporations, threatened by these moves, are lobbying their governments for sanctions. Financial institutions are already tightening loan conditions, hoping to punish the bold. News outlets are branding these moves as reckless, populist, and dangerous. Yet in Africa, they are being called something else: freedom. And it's catching on. Namibia is eyeing tighter control of its lithium fields. Guinea is reassessing its iron ore exports. Even Zambia is challenging old copper deals. It's not about nationalism in the old sense, it's about survival. Africa is done exporting raw value while importing misery. The soil is no longer just a battlefield, it's the prize. And as African nations tear up colonial-era mining contracts and write their own, one question is quietly haunting the boardrooms of Paris, London, and Washington. What happens when the world's most resource-rich continent stops selling and starts setting the price? But minerals are only half the equation. The other half is movement. What happens when African borders begin to vanish, not for superstates, but for all Africans? If Africa's land is being reclaimed underground through resource control, then above ground, something just as radical is happening. The walls between Africans are coming down. And unlike the artificial lines drawn by colonial rulers, these walls weren't made of brick or barbed wire. They were made of bureaucracy, suspicion, and the quiet poison of disunity. But now, those walls are being demolished. The moment Burkina Faso announced visa-free entry for all African citizens, it sent a signal more powerful than any summit declaration. In a single stroke, it challenged one of the continent's most entrenched habits, treating fellow Africans like foreigners. For decades, it was easier for a European or American to move freely across African nations than for an African to do the same. That contradiction has now been torn open. But this wasn't just a policy change, it was a cultural reversal. For generations, colonial divisions trained Africans to think in fragments: Anglophone versus Francophone, Muslim versus Christian, West versus East. Airports became checkpoints for identity, and embassies became gatekeepers of suspicion. Burkina Faso's decision turns that logic inside out. It says, "You are African first. The rest is paperwork." This is not merely symbolic. The practical effects are already unfolding. Traders from Togo can now cross into Burkina Faso without fees or fear. Students from Senegal can explore academic programs without worrying about restrictive immigration laws. Small entrepreneurs are finding new markets next door instead of overseas. A region that once choked on its fragmentation is now breathing through connection. But Burkina Faso's move is only one part of the new map taking shape. Ghana's investment in Burkina Faso's infrastructure, specifically in waste management and renewable energy, is a quiet revolution. For decades, such cooperation would have come through European or American intermediaries, packaged as development aid, diluted through foreign consultancies, and returned as debt. But this time, no foreign signatures were needed. One African country saw potential in another and invested. This is the blueprint for Africa's new economy: horizontal partnerships instead of vertical dependence. Ghana didn't come to donate, it came to build. And in doing so, it proved that African countries are not too poor to help each other. They've just been too divided. Until now. What's emerging is a grassroots continentalism. Not the kind crafted in elite halls with carefully worded communiques, but a lived Pan-Africanism driven by movement, trade, and trust. In marketplaces from Accra to Ouagadougou, the borders are already softening. Goods are moving faster. People are finding new neighbors. And the fear that once came with foreign checkpoints is slowly being replaced by a sense of belonging. Yet, this shift is also strategic. The East African community is accelerating talks for a unified passport. The Alliance of Sahel states is mulling a shared defense policy that includes not just military coordination, but economic planning and transportation links. These moves are not utopian gestures, they are survival tactics. The world is changing fast, and Africa is tired of playing catch-up on someone else's map. If it is to rise, it must rise together, and the people feel it. Across social media, artists, students, and activists are embracing a new continental identity. Music collaborations ignore colonial language divides. Movements like Borderless Africa are gaining traction. Pan-African festivals and startups are no longer rare. They are multiplying. It is no longer just an elite class talking about unity. It is young Africans, born after the Cold War, who are carrying the vision forward. For them, Pan-Africanism is not nostalgia, it's a necessity. Of course, this terrifies the old world order. Because when Africans move freely, they collaborate. When they collaborate, they organize. And when they organize, they demand. Visa-free travel is not just a passport issue. It's a gateway to political awakening. It means fewer foreign embassies dictating who gets to move, and more African governments deciding what kind of future they want. And this raises a question far more dangerous to global power brokers than any speech at the UN. What happens when 1.4 billion people start seeing each other as one? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The borders are falling, not in chaos, but in coordination, not through conquest, but through confidence. And now that Africa is moving within, the world outside is starting to feel less necessary. But power never concedes without a fight. And now that Africa has found its voice, reclaimed its wealth, and redrawn its future, the reaction from the old order has begun. Quietly, subtly, and sometimes violently, the empire is striking back. But this time, Africa is ready. Behind closed doors in Brussels, Washington, and Paris, a new kind of strategy is forming. Not the overt colonial domination of the past, but the modern equivalent: economic sabotage, diplomatic isolation, media manipulation, and proxy interference. The more Africa asserts itself, the more these counterattacks intensify. But unlike the past, when coups were engineered in secrecy or puppet leaders installed with ease, today's Africa is watching and fighting back with equal cunning. The first weapon being deployed is narrative control. In Western newsrooms, stories about Africa's rise are often buried beneath headlines of instability, populist leaders, or insurgency. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger announced their superstate plans, many global outlets didn't lead with unity. They led with doubt. Words like radical, dangerous, and authoritarian were thrown like darts, not to inform, but to frame. Africa is not being judged by its vision, but by its refusal to follow Western templates. The message is clear. When Africa leads itself, it must be punished in the court of public opinion. Yet the script isn't working like it used to. African citizens have their media now. From pan-African news platforms to viral TikTok pages and rebel radio shows, the counter-narrative is spreading faster than foreign propaganda can keep up. Young Africans are hearing directly from their leaders, watching their nations negotiate, win, and retaliate. They no longer need a BBC translation to understand their worth. Then comes economic warfare. In the months following Niger's nationalization of uranium, European firms quietly began pressuring banks to blacklist African resource ministries. In Batswana, diamond contracts are being weaponized in international courts to delay the new profit-sharing structure. In the DRC, mineral traders face increasing regulatory red tape from former buyers who now fear African independence more than they fear instability. These aren't coincidences. They're targeted maneuvers, designed to make self-reliance look like a mistake. And yet, the African response hasn't been panic. It's been recalibrated. Countries are beginning to hedge against Western backlash with alternative alliances. Russia, China, Turkey, and even BRICS partners are being courted, not just for investment, but as strategic insurance. New banks, new currencies, and even new satellite infrastructure are being explored to shield against the West's financial punishments. Africa isn't retreating, it's diversifying. It is learning from the very powers that once dominated it. You must never depend on one empire. In parallel, the military dimension is shifting too. Where once African security meant Western boots on African soil, it now means African soldiers trained by African nations. The Alliance of Sahel states is forming defense protocols not to serve foreign interests, but to protect African ones. Military drills are happening without NATO oversight. Intelligence networks are forming between capitals without a single US advisor in the room. But perhaps the most dangerous weapon being used against Africa's rise is division. Every Pan-African dream has always been vulnerable to internal sabotage. And now, efforts to exploit linguistic, ethnic, and religious differences are intensifying. Foreign-funded NGOs, think tanks, and influencers are subtly amplifying old rivalries, painting Pan-Africanism as unrealistic, risky, or incompatible with democracy. The goal is to break the rhythm before it becomes irreversible. But Africa is no longer an orchestra of disconnected instruments. It is becoming a rhythm section, unified in tempo. The people are watching. They see what happened in Libya. They see the manipulation in Sudan. They understand how promises from abroad can collapse a country faster than any war. And they are demanding that their governments play a different tune this time. This doesn't mean the road ahead is easy. It may get darker before the sunrise. Sanctions will increase. Smear campaigns will multiply. Political threats will grow. But the difference is, Africa is no longer walking blindfolded. It knows who it's fighting. It knows what's at stake. And most of all, it knows what it's becoming. Because once a continent stops pretending to be weak, no empire, no smear, no sanction can make it bow again. Do you think this time they can make Africa bow? What happens if Africa wins? Let us know in the comment section. Are you ready to fight for Africa's true freedom this time? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.